At the beginning, it feels like a gift, the ability to feel deeply, to pick up on what others are going through, to sense emotions that aren't even being spoken. It creates a sense of connection that most people never experience at that level. You understand people without needing long explanations. You notice what's off before anyone says a word, but what starts as a strength can quickly turn into something else if it's not managed, because feeling everything doesn't automatically mean you can handle everything. And this is where most people get stuck. They don't learn how to filter what they feel. They don't learn how to separate what belongs to them from what they've absorbed from others. So everything blends together. Their own emotions, other people's emotions, the environment around them, it all becomes one continuous stream. And over time, that stream turns into overload. It shows up in small ways at first. Feeling drained after conversations, carrying emotions long after situations have ended, overthinking interactions that other people have already moved on from. But gradually it builds, because without control, there's no limit to what you take in. Every room, every conversation, every interaction adds another layer. And instead of processing and releasing, it accumulates, it stays, it lingers, it weighs on your energy in a way that's hard to explain to someone who doesn't experience it. So instead of empathy feeling like clarity, it starts to feel like confusion. You're not just aware of emotions, you're overwhelmed by them. And when you're overwhelmed, your decisions change. You start reacting instead of choosing. You start prioritizing other people's emotional states over your own stability. You adjust your behavior to keep things calm, to avoid conflict, to reduce tension, even if it means ignoring what you actually need. Because when everything feels intense, the goal becomes relief, not growth. And that's the trap, because staying in that state keeps you in a cycle. You keep feeling, reacting, adjusting, but never stepping back enough to understand what's happening or how to control it. You don't move forward. You just keep managing the same emotional patterns in different situations. And over time, it creates exhaustion, not just physical, but mental and emotional. A constant background weight that makes everything feel heavier than it should. This is why most never reach the next level, not because they lack depth, but because they never develop control over that depth. They stay in the phase where empathy is something that happens to them instead of something they can direct. And until that shift happens, the sensitivity that could have become clarity remains overload. And when empathy stays uncontrolled, it doesn't elevate you. It keeps you stuck exactly where you started. There's a moment that looks like growth, but quietly keeps people in the same place. It's the moment you start understanding why people behave the way they do. You see their past, their struggles, their insecurities. You recognize the patterns behind their actions. You connect the dots that most people never even notice. And at first, it feels like clarity, because now things make sense. But here's where it shifts. Understanding is supposed to give you awareness, not permission. And this is where most people get stuck without realizing it. They take that awareness and turn it into acceptance of everything. They start explaining away behavior that should have been addressed. They begin to justify patterns that continue to harm them simply because they can see the reason behind them. He didn't mean it. They've been through a lot. They're just reacting to their past. And while those things might be true, they don't change the impact, because understanding someone's behavior doesn't remove the effect it has on you. But when you're deeply empathetic, there's a tendency to prioritize explanation over experience, to focus more on why something happened than on what it did to you. And that creates a dangerous imbalance, because the more you explain, the more you tolerate, and the more you tolerate, the longer the pattern continues. This is how cycles form, not because you don't see what's happening, but because you see it too clearly and choose to stay anyway. You hold on to potential. You believe that awareness should lead to change. You expect that if you understand someone deeply enough, things will eventually shift. But understanding doesn't create change. Action does. And when that action isn't there, when behavior stays the same despite all the reasons behind it, then continuing to accept it isn't empathy anymore. It's self-neglect. This is the line most people never draw. They think being empathetic means staying, tolerating, giving endless chances. They believe walking away would mean they didn't understand enough, didn't care enough, didn't try hard enough. But the truth is the opposite. Real awareness includes recognizing when understanding is no longer enough. When you've seen the pattern clearly, when you've given space, when you've allowed time and nothing changes, then continuing to accept it isn't growth, it's stagnation. Because growth requires a shift from observation to decision, from seeing clearly to acting is uncomfortable. It means letting go of the idea that everyone will change just because you understand them. It means accepting that some patterns continue, no matter how deeply you analyze them. And once you accept that, your behavior has to change too, not out of anger, not out of frustration, but out of alignment with what you now know to be true. because understanding without action keeps you in the same cycle. And cycles don't break until someone decides to stop accepting what they already see clearly. There's a point where giving starts to feel automatic. You don't even think about it anymore. You adjust, you accommodate, you make space for others without needing to be asked. It feels natural, almost like it's part of who you are. And for a long time, it works. People feel comfortable around you. They open up, they rely on your presence, your understanding, your willingness to meet them where they are. And because you can sense what others need, you often step in before they even have to say it. But there's something missing in that process, a line, a point where you decide how much is enough. And for many, that line never gets clearly defined because the moment you try to draw it, something feels off. Saying no doesn't feel neutral. It feels like rejection. Pulling back doesn't feel like balance. It feels like you're letting someone down. Choosing yourself doesn't feel like strength. It feels like guilt. So instead of setting boundaries, you keep adjusting, you stretch a little more, you give a little more, you tolerate a little more. And each time it feels justified. It feels like the right thing to do in the moment. But over time, that pattern builds because without boundaries, there's no structure to your empathy. It flows outward constantly without direction, without limits. And when something has no limits, it eventually becomes unsustainable. You start to notice the imbalance. You're there for others, but not always for yourself. You're understanding, but not always understood. You're giving, but not always receiving at the same level. And yet, even when you see it, it's hard to change because boundaries feel unfamiliar. They feel like you're going against your nature, like you're becoming someone colder, more distant, less compassionate. And that identity doesn't sit comfortably, so you avoid it. You tell yourself you'll set boundaries later when things get worse, when it becomes absolutely necessary. But by the time it feels necessary, you're already drained, already stretched beyond what feels stable. And that's the cost of waiting because boundaries aren't something you set only when things break. They're what prevent things from breaking in the first place. They're not about pushing people away. They're about defining how people can stay. They create clarity. They let others know where you stand, what you're available for, what you're not. And more importantly, they create a structure that protects your energy so that your empathy doesn't turn into exhaustion. But to reach that point, you have to shift how you see boundaries, not as rejection, not as selfishness, but as responsibility for your own stability, your own emotional balance, your own long-term growth. Because without that responsibility, empathy stays reactive. It keeps responding to everything around it without direction, without control. And when empathy has no boundaries, it doesn't evolve. It just keeps giving until there's nothing left to give. There's a subtle moment where everything could change. But most people hesitate because up to this point, everything has been driven by emotion, feeling deeply, understanding deeply, reacting based on what's sensed in the moment. And for a while, that feels like awareness. But there comes a point where feeling more doesn't lead to clarity anymore. It just creates more noise, more interpretations, more possibilities, more internal conversations trying to figure out what something might mean instead of seeing what it actually is. And this is where the shift is supposed to happen, from emotion to clarity. Not by losing the ability to feel, but by stepping back enough to see without being influenced by every emotional signal, by separating what's real from what's imagined, what's consistent from what's occasional, what's being shown from what's being projected. This shift requires something most people resist, letting go of illusions, because emotions often come with hope that someone will change, hope that a situation will improve, hope that what you feel reflects something real and lasting. And when you move toward clarity, that hope gets tested. You start looking at patterns instead of moments. You focus on consistency instead of isolated behavior. You stop asking, what could this be? And start asking, what has this consistently shown itself to be? And the answers aren't always comfortable. Sometimes they contradict what you wanted to believe. Sometimes they reveal that the connection isn't what you thought it was, that the effort isn't equal, that the understanding isn't mutual. And this is where many people pause because clarity comes with responsibility. Once you see something clearly, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to interpreting it in a softer way. You can't continue responding as if you don't know what you now know. So instead of fully stepping into clarity, they stay in emotion. They keep analyzing, keep feeling, keep searching for a version of the situation that aligns with what they want to be true. Because staying in emotion allows for flexibility. It keeps possibilities open. Clarity, on the other hand, closes them. It narrows everything down to what is actually happening. And that requires action. It requires decisions that match reality, not preference. And that's uncomfortable because it might mean stepping back, setting limits, or even walking away from something that once felt meaningful. But avoiding that shift comes with a cost. Because without clarity, empathy stays unstructured. It continues to respond to feelings instead of facts. It keeps adjusting to temporary moments instead of stable patterns. And that keeps you in the same cycles, just with different faces, different situations. So the real growth doesn't come from feeling more. It comes from seeing more accurately, from allowing yourself to move beyond emotional interpretation into grounded understanding. Because the moment you choose clarity over comfort, everything starts to change. And that's the step most people never take. There's a phase that feels like progress, but quietly keeps everything the same. It's the phase where you're constantly working on healing. You're reflecting, analyzing, trying to understand your patterns, your reactions, your past. You're putting effort into becoming better, more aware, more balanced. And on the surface, it looks like growth. But there's a difference between processing and progressing, because if you stay in that mode too long, it becomes a loop. You keep revisiting the same insights, the same realizations, the same emotional patterns, just from slightly different angles. You understand more each time, but your external reality doesn't change in the same way. You're still dealing with similar situations, still attracting similar dynamics, still responding in ways that feel familiar. And that's when healing stops being a step forward and becomes a place you stay. Not intentionally, but gradually, because healing feels safe. It keeps your focus inward. It gives you something to work on. It creates a sense of movement without requiring major external shifts. You can always say, I'm still figuring things out, or I just need more time. And sometimes that's true, but not always, because at some point, the information you need is already there. You've identified the patterns. You've understood the triggers. You've seen where things go wrong. The awareness exists. What's missing isn't more understanding. It's application. It's the moment where you take everything you've learned and start making different choices, not just thinking about them, not just planning them, but actually acting on them. And that's where many people hesitate, because action changes things. It changes dynamics. It changes relationships. It changes how others respond to you. And it forces you to step out of the role you've been comfortable in, even if that role wasn't ideal. Healing allows you to stay in observation. Growth requires you to step into control over your decisions, your boundaries, your direction. And that shift can feel unfamiliar, because it means you're no longer just understanding what's happening. You're influencing what happens next. You're no longer waiting for things to improve. You're deciding what you allow, what you continue, what you walk away from. And that responsibility can feel heavy, but without it, nothing really changes. You stay in the same cycles, just with more awareness of them. You recognize the patterns, but you don't break them. You see the dynamics, but you don't alter your role within them. And over time, that creates frustration, because knowing more but living the same way creates a gap between awareness and action. And that gap is where most people remain. Not because they can't grow, but because they never fully transition out of healing mode. They keep preparing for change without ever stepping into it. But growth isn't something you wait to feel ready for. It's something you step into, even when it feels unfamiliar. Because the moment you stop just processing your patterns and start changing them, that's when you finally move forward. There's one final step, and it's the one most people resist the most, because everything up to this point still feels aligned with who they believe they are. Feeling deeply, understanding others, healing, growing, it all fits within the identity they've built. But this last shift challenges that identity. It introduces something that feels unfamiliar, even uncomfortable: detachment. And for many, that word carries the wrong meaning. It sounds like coldness, like distance, like becoming someone who no longer cares. So they avoid it. They associate it with losing their empathy, losing their softness, losing the very thing that makes them who they are. But that's not what detachment actually is. Detachment isn't the absence of care. It's the presence of control. It's the ability to feel without being pulled in every direction by what you feel. It's the ability to understand someone without automatically absorbing their emotional state. It's the space between what you experience and how you choose to respond to it. And that space changes everything, because without it, empathy is reactive. You feel something and it immediately influences your behavior. It shapes your decisions in real time. It pulls you into situations, into dynamics, into emotional states that you didn't consciously choose. But with detachment, there's a pause, a moment where you can observe what you're feeling without becoming it, a moment where you can ask, is this mine? Is this something I need to carry? Is this a situation I should invest in? And in that pause, you regain control. You stop being driven purely by emotional input and start making decisions based on clarity. This doesn't make you less empathetic. It makes your empathy more precise. You're no longer giving it everywhere. You're directing it intentionally. You're choosing where it belongs and where it doesn't. You're deciding what deserves your energy and what doesn't meet that standard. And that selectivity is what most people struggle with because it requires letting go of the need to be there for everyone, letting go of the idea that caring means staying, letting go of the habit of overextending yourself just to maintain connection. It also means accepting that not every situation needs your involvement. Not every person needs your understanding. Not every emotion needs your response. And once you accept that, your behavior changes. You become calmer, not because there's less happening around you, but because you're no longer absorbing everything that happens. You become clearer because your decisions are no longer clouded by emotional overload. You become stronger because your energy is no longer scattered. And that strength is quiet. It doesn't need to prove itself. It shows up in how you respond or choose not to respond, in what you engage with and what you leave untouched, in the way you maintain your balance, regardless of what's happening externally. This is the stage where empathy stops being something that controls you and becomes something you control. And once you reach that point, everything becomes more intentional. Your connections, your decisions, your presence, because you're no longer reacting to the world. You're choosing how much of it you allow to reach you.